once we go into the shed, it's lice and mites, external parasites. But even now, if there's still some animals out in fields, there might be a problem with gutworms and lungworm or hoose. There can still be a problem at this time of year. And hoose in particular, I'd be careful of this year just because it has been ideal conditions for these parasites over the last few weeks.
Hello and welcome to the Beef Edge, the Teagasc beef podcast for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and in this final part of a 3-part podcast series, Getting Winter Ready, Natascha Meunier from Animal Health Ireland is on this week's Beef Edge podcast to discuss health at housing. Natascha, you're very welcome. A lot of cattle were housed over the past fortnight. What are the key parasites that farmers should keep in mind this winter?
It's the same usual fellows, shall we say. This time of year, round about autumn time, we're looking at liver fluke and rumen fluke. Once we go into the shed, it's lice and mites, external parasites. But even now, if there's still some animals out in fields, there might be a problem with gutworms and lungworm or hoose. There can still be a problem at this time of year. And hoose in particular, I'd be careful of this year just because it has been ideal conditions for these parasites over the last few weeks.
And what products, Natascha, should farmers be using when it comes to treating cattle for worms?
We usually want to use a clear drench or a white drench. Now, the white drench can also be quite helpful for liver fluke, but the reason we're using either of these is because the Teagasc gutworm, that's just its name, it can go into a dormant stage at this time of the year, and the yellow wormers don't work well against this life stage. When it comes to hoose, if that's what we're trying to target, the lungworm parasites, all of our broad spectrum wormers, so that's yellow wormers, white wormers, all the clear wormers, they all work against the lungworm. Now, when it comes to the timing itself, that can differ depending on when they were last treated, when you're planning to house them or when they've been housed, what product you used last and what the risk is from the pastures. So, for example, the clear drenches, they tend to have a little bit of persistence. So if you've treated them with something like that, it might tide you over to the housing period if you're planning to house them in the next few weeks, and they might not need something else at housing per se.
And then in relation to fluke, Natascha, what products should cattle be treated with for fluke?
They're slightly different to your worms, as they tend to have this really long life cycle, up to 12 weeks until they become adult parasites. And animals can be infected early in the autumn, right until housing. So you can imagine in any one animal, they might have this a range of life stages of this liver fluke parasite. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it is because when it comes to choosing the products, it's really important just to check the label and see what life stage does the flukicide actually work against. So a lot of them only target, for example, the adult parasites. And if you give that then at the start of housing, it's obviously going to kill the adults, but you might have a few immatures, so early or mid-stage fluke as well. And so you think you've treated everything, but those immature stages aren't affected.
And you mentioned there the product is very important, particularly when it comes to the performance over the winter. Like farmers that have the beef health check report, they could be surprised when they realise the product that they used was incorrect next spring when they slaughter cattle and it shows up that, fluke were present, and by then it's often too late to make any changes.
Just to think about, what did you use last year? Have a look at the reports from, if you've got some beef health check reports, some abattoir reports from earlier in the year, you're expecting that you wouldn't see any liver fluke if that treatment was effective. So, those immature flukes, they'll keep growing. They affect your animal's performance. So depending on what you used, you might need to go in later with the same type of product, or you can use a product that targets maybe the younger life stage of those parasites. So which one you choose, though, really depends on how big a risk fluke is on your farm. If you've got sheep as well, which many farmers do, you might also handle it differently just because liver fluke tend to be much more of a problem for sheep than they are for cattle.
And then in relation to rumen fluke, Natascha, how does that differ, or is it a biggest problem as we think?
It's a completely different parasite to liver fluke, although they share the same name, and they actually share a fairly similar life cycle. So it also takes a number of weeks, 12 weeks, for those adults to appear, and you also need a mud snail on the farm. But generally speaking, there's a lot of rumen fluke in Ireland. So maybe half the farms in Ireland probably have it, but we're only seeing problems on a small number of farms. But if it is a problem on your farm, then you might need to be treating for it. But the issues that you see tend to be the animals, maybe even a few animals, they're just doing poorly, maybe a bit of scour, they're just losing weight, they're not putting on any weight when you're expecting them to. It might be even your older animals, maybe your yearlings, where you don't really expect that worms are going to be a problem. And they don't respond to your other kind of gutworm treatments. And then it could be the rumen fluke that's a cause. And I'd suggest you chat to your vet, just because there's only really one medicine that's available for that one. But actually, for any of your parasite treatments, when you're planning, or if you've got some kind of a specific problem, chat to your vet, because they'll give you very specific advice for your farm. Whereas what we're talking about here, just our general guidelines.
I suppose when it comes to lice, what products should farmers be considering, and when should cattle be actually treated for lice?
Two main type of products that are available. You get the ones that target just the lice and flies. So those are your deltamethrins or cypermethrin type products, and they could be pour-ons or spot-ons. And then you get the clear drenches, so your ivermectin type products, and they can be pour-ons or injectables. So you usually start to see problem with lice around about Christmas time, once they've been in the house for a while. It's that hot, humid environment that encourages the lice to grow. But when you are treating, just make sure, whichever product you're using, just make sure you're treating all of the animals in the shed, because all that will happen is, your critters will jump to your untreated animals, and your problem just continues. And you might need to treat twice over the season. It just depends. So the products don't work against the eggs. Those hatch out in about 3 to 4 weeks, and then you might have a problem again.
And with biting and sucking lice, Natascha, the product you choose is very important.
There is this distinction between types of lice. There's more than one type, and you get these chewing or these biting lice, and they tend to be on the surface of the skin, whereas you also get sucking lice, which tend to burrow a little bit deeper. And what you find is that your pour-on type products work quite well for the chewing lice on the surface, and your injectables work better for the ones that dig a little bit deeper. But the truth is, you're not going to really know unless the product doesn't work. So it also could be a case that in some that you might have mites on the farm, and then there's certain products that don't even work against the mites. So if you ever find a situation where the product doesn't just seem to be working as you'd expect, maybe just chat to your vet for these tricky cases, and they can diagnose exactly which parasite you're dealing with and make sure that the treatment's correct.
And for farmers that's purchasing in cattle, Natascha, how could their health plan differ?
Is always going to be a bit of a riskier business. You don't really know where those animals have been. You don't know what diseases they could have had, or what they're bringing onto the farm, and you don't really know if they've been vaccinated. So, it's ideally what you want to do with those animals that you're buying in is just isolate them away from your main group. And that could be that they maybe stay in the shed while your animals are still out, or they're just on a different field somewhere. And just for those initial few days, to make sure that they're not bringing in some kind of a respiratory disease, a pneumonia or something like that, that they're not clinically sick in those first few days. The process of buying animals, moving them to a new place, moving them maybe with other animals, getting them to a mart, they might be exposed to something. It's a very stressful period for them, and that's when your respiratory diseases, your pneumonias, really become a problem. The ideal, though, if you is to get them vaccinated. If you know the where they're coming from, the source farmer, get them vaccinated before they even move. That would be ideal, but obviously that's not the case. Not possible in most cases. But they also might need a fluke or a worm dose when they arrive. So it just depends. But then once they're all healthy, you've checked them for a few days, they seem healthy. Then just catch them up to your vaccination plan on the farm, so that they're all ready. They've been vaccinated before they go into the shed with the others.
And if there does happen to be an outbreak or a sick animal on the farm, what's kind of the best procedure or protocol for the farm?
Isolate those animals, just bring them out of the main group, just so that you can prevent disease spreading from those sick animals to hopefully keeping the other ones healthy. But then after that, treat them like you would treat any kind of sick family member. A nice warm, spot, a dry bedded pen, or if they're outside, a nice sheltered paddock. Make sure that they've got plenty of fresh, clean water. Offer them good quality feed because they might not have great appetite. And then, get the vet out if they're starting to have quite a severe fever or they're looking really down, they're not eating, they're starting to struggle a bit.
And then in relation to pneumonia, we'll see it this time of year, sometimes when cattle are housed, Natascha, what's the best mode of action if there's a pneumonia issue on farm?
Prevention is definitely better than cure, so making sure that those animals are fully vaccinated before they go into the shed. And your young animals are particularly prone to getting some kind of a pneumonia. So it's when they share that airspace, perhaps with some older animals. The older animals might just be carrying the disease. They don't look clinically ill, but they'll pass on those bacteria or those viruses to those younger animals. So you want to give them the best shot. You want to make sure they're vaccinated before they even go in. And some vaccine, it differs by vaccine, depending on which one you buy, but many of them require two shots, usually a couple of weeks apart. Just make sure they get that booster shot before they go in, because they need that second booster, just for it to work effectively. Some vaccines, though, you only need one shot, but those tend to be a little bit shorter lived from a protective immunity point of view. So just be aware that if it's been a couple of months, you think your animals might be vaccinated, but if it's been a couple of months, they might actually need a booster now to make sure that they're fully protected for the housing season.
And in the next couple of weeks, Natascha, cattle are housed. What would you advise from an animal health point of view?
We've chatted a little bit about treatments and so on, but some of the practical things, is just making sure that there's access to clean water. The water troughs can get really, really dirty, particularly once the animals have been there for a while. And then if that water's dirty, they just don't drink as much as they should. So if you're starting to feed meal and so on, they might just not. They might not take in as much meal as they should just because they're not drinking as much water. So it can actually impact their productivity in that time. So it's a simple one, but sometimes we forget about it. And then also when it comes to space, just when you were calculating the space requirements, are you doing it for the animal that's going to be coming out the other end in a few months' time rather than the animals going in? Because if they're overcrowded, they can get a bit stressed. You could get a little bit of bullying between animals, and that might lead to one or two that just don't eat enough and then have a bit of a growth check.
That's great, Natascha. Some great tips and advice there. That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Natascha for joining me on the show. If you missed previous episode in this 3-part podcast series, don't forget to tune back to the previous episodes on winter housing and winter nutrition. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For all other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Teagasc and thanks for listening.